my boots on and lace them up. Hard work, not another day's work. Hard work.
Happy to answer any questions or hear any comments. I can talk about transfusion forever. So, yes.
This is more of a comment. It occurs to me that I am aware that that interspecies, intra is that the right word, donation is still routine in other, well, non-human medicine, in animal medicine. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'd never thought about the fact that in some places it may still be done in human medicine, though I don't think that in the veterinary schema there's not going to be the Gothic imagery. Though,
right.
Though the phrase donor sheep is funny. I've actually heard that phrase.
That's interesting.
But it's so much of this is I guess I'm fascinated that these practices still exist, but they're just not full of this imagery.
Right, all of that. Yeah, and you can see, I mean, you wouldn't want that imagery to be present when you're trying to kind of advocate a treatment or advocate some kind of intervention. That's right. But yeah, and where we do have that crossing of boundaries is with, say, pig hearts and valves, and there some things do cross the animal-human line a little bit, but they have to be very carefully controlled.
Transgenic species are concerned about GMOs.
Yep.
I see some of the same patterns in language.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's a great comment.
There was that artist who injected herself with
horse blood.
Yes.
Which is, you can see this on YouTube. I find that incredibly upsetting. But she's a performance artist, and she kind of gradually built up to injecting horse blood into her own veins. I don't understand the the medical stuff going on there, and how because she should have been making herself more allergic to that by repeated doses of it. But anyway, I haven't talked to a hematologist about it, but yes, you can see that on YouTube, that performance that she does. And again, it gets back to donor sheep. The thing I find particularly upsetting about that is that animal cannot consent to being used in this way. And we can talk a little bit about other forms of using animals, but in that case, I mean, it's very clear that that horse, I mean, he's being used for her art. He can't have any say in that. But
so where does different blood types and R positive and R negative, how is all this different transfusion without any blood typing or anything? How are people not reacting?
Some of them do, but and that's right. So the blood types will not be, as they won't be, discovered, quote unquote, until about 1910, 1911. But even then, people did not type blood for a much longer period of time because they're transfusing blood in absolute traumatic situations, and they don't have time to do all of that. So they're still doing random transfusions for a long time. But in our world right now, if we had to do a random transfusion, each one of us would have a 50-50 chance of surviving a random transfusion statistically. That if you're hemorrhaging to death, you might take even that option. But probably in England at this time, it has a much more heterogeneous population, and so the chances were, husbands no, which is really so unfortunate too. When you think about it, the husbands were higher risk donors than the mothers, sisters, cousins. But they are, and some people, it's important to note, some people do seem to be saved by blood transfusion in the 19th century. But as even in the 19th century, anti-transfusionists point out, you can't be sure those people wouldn't have lived anyway. Yes, it's very hard retroactively to try to figure out what the actual cure rate of 19th century transfusion was.
Amazing that in interspecies transfusion that people don't react to that.
They probably, first of all, they weren't getting much blood into those veins. And then secondly, they weren't recognizing the reaction to incompatible blood as a reaction to incompatible blood. So it's just lucky that they closed that line of experimentation down so quickly, because people would have been killed by that.
You talked a little bit about sort of the not a lot of language around sort of men donating to women and all that status, but I find this really fascinating because at the same time, there's a lot of conversation about different types of British citizens are starting to develop. This like British citizen in the colonies. Like it's the first time in British history where they're actually having this distinction, and laws are coming up like the Seaman Act and all of these things at the same time. So, as an undergraduate British historian, I find this very fascinating. Was there any sort of parallel in the literature, kind of at the same time? Because at one point you have this universal donorship not being distinguished, but was there sort of issues of that coming up?
Right, and the medical discourse isn't going to pay any attention to that whatsoever, but in the fictions, they really go to town with that. And my favorite, there's a novel that I write on in this project, and Blood, A Tragic Tale. That's a great, from 1888. And in this tragic tale, this young woman, lovely young woman's wasting away for some unspecified reason, and her physician uncle decides that a transfusion would be useful. He finds this kind of seamy guy to act as the donor. While the transfusion is going on, the uncle mysteriously loses consciousness for a while. When he regains consciousness, all of the man's blood has been transfused into the woman's body. Okay, and so first there's this plethora where she absorbs all this blood, and then what happens is kind of involuntary gender reassignment surgery. So that she's gone completely. Her body is there, and what's inhabiting this body is her male donor, his mind, his memories, his desires. And then this novel is really astonishing. And then he decides, this can really work well for me. And it ends with him about to marry a duke. Yes, but there is that kind of toying with the idea of, well, what happens when you mingle these categories, and race too, as you're pointing out, this whole anxiety about the purity of the race, the incursions of colonialism, that kind of appears obliquely in the fictions, but not at all. And then, just one more story. A woman is transfused with cat blood by her husband, who's trying to cure her, and she becomes a cat woman, of course. Yes.
So it seems like a lot of these scenarios are probably obstetric situations where the woman's hemorrhaging after childbirth.
Yes.
Is there much documentation of trying other measures, like realizing the cause of the hemorrhage and surgically treating that? Or?
Right. They do have their standard kinds of procedures, so there's a lot of attempt at clamping. I've read case histories where the doctor talks about how long he has just had his hand around, trying to staunch this flow of blood. And so compression bandages, different kinds of trying to use other tampon things, but of course, they don't work well, And then also we've got this whole other thing that's happening, which is fever and infection, so that's killing off a huge number of their patients as well. And they're not necessarily distinguishing, what the cause of death is, but they just don't have other forms. They're not performing cesareans, yet. They will start to, and that's a part of this too, a little bit. But so they can't just say, okay, now we have to just do a cesarean to remove this hemorrhaging. They can't do any of that. Nope, they didn't do any of that. Yeah.
Was there much depiction of a lot of what we've seen are men giving their blood to women? In war settings, were men often giving blood to their comrades?
Yes, and that's what's going to really change the history of transfusion, and that's what I stop at. I think that this is the real beginning of the modern, the second phase of the modern story of transfusion, and that is the impact of war on the development of transfusion. So I end in 1897 when it still is very much this obstetric intervention. But then what's going in it, and then transfusion does taper off a bit. People lose interest in it, but then it's war that really reinvigorates interest, and then creates and leads to the development of blood storage and things that that these technologies come about in response to wartime trauma. Yes.
There's a fascinating book that my book club is reading now called Blood, History and Commerce by Douglas.
Yes, Douglas Starr. Yes, that's a terrific book.
It is. It's a really interesting book, and it was wonderful to hear that. It sounds like both of you are using some of the same.
Yeah, he says that some of the history, the early history,
Oh, yes.
Mhm,
Yes.
mhm.
But he goes,
and then goes into AIDS and then all of the contaminated blood.
and then the birth of the Red Cross.
Yes,
And then going
yes.
in terms of commerce.
Mhm,
So.
mhm.
But no literary.
No, no. And also, mentioning the Red Cross, I mean, it is interesting, too, to think, if you're talking about Great Britain or the United States, you're going to be talking about such different issues revolving around blood. And so race, again, that there would be a whole other story to tell about ideas of blood and race in the United States. And those, again, they don't filter into the British discourse at all. There's none of that sense of, nothing about one drop or how many drops or, none of that sense that you have to segregate the blood supply, which the Red Cross did have to do early on, that none of that appears in the British context.
Well, I was actually moving up to the modern times because I'm assuming that you're probably going to move into the next century, right?
No, I'm staying right here, but I'm interested in it. No, I'm interested in it, but yeah.
Yeah, because having worked in a hospital laboratory and done blood banking and hematology, one of the things was I was there in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And so there was that whole coming back to the fear of transfusion.
Yeah.
Thing, right? And so I had heard about an artist who was infected himself with AIDS, and he decided to do exhibits with materials that had his blood inside them. And the controversy of people just exhibiting those materials, not touching and handling in any way, it was really interesting, showing the power of blood and the visualization of it in art. It just it's sad.
Yeah, and it also, it speaks, we can't get over our sense that blood has a kind of supernatural power. So even looking will have some effect on you, even, that's obviously not true, but the sense that it has this mystical capacity to invade us or to be contagious.
Were there any attempts of within a woman's hemorrhaging to try and capture her blood, or anybody?
There was one letter in the Lancet that I read that was really interesting, where he talks about why can't you just kind of recycle that blood, but he's thinking more of, even though he knows about transfusion, he's thinking more about drinking blood. He's kind of back to this earlier model of what is blood as a kind of nutriment, is injection of blood kind of intravenous feeding. So he's writing in a letter to the Lancet. I don't think anyone actually gave that a try, but he does suggest that why don't we just try to use that blood but none of the transfusion advocates tried to collect that blood, and I don't know if they felt then that it was back to this idea that it was contaminated somehow, that there was something wrong with it once that had happened. That there was something where it was damaged, but they don't try to do that. Yes.
So in Milton, which I heard in your bio that you teach,
Yeah.
Milton is also living at a time where the Copernican Revolution is having a dramatic effect. In Paradise Lost, you see the references to Galileo, but then also one of the books is basically Adam sitting down with an angel saying, "So, what's going on with this thing?" And the angel's opinion is, "Well, do you really care? Is this really something you need to consider?"
Yeah, do you need to know this?
So the thing that I'm wondering about is with transfusion in the 19th century, do you see the same sort of issue in medicine that you saw a century earlier in astronomy and in cosmology, where people are moving from one regime of thinking into another? And is transfusion just one of the symptoms of a larger discourse in medicine surrounding a deeper core issue to the profession?
No, that's a great question, and that's true. Transfusion is part, in the 19th century, is part of this whole move toward experimental medicine. Physiology as a subject didn't exist until the 19th century, and it took a long time to take hold in Britain. There was a lot of anxiety about physiology and about experimental medicine, and transfusion's a piece of that. So it is part of a shift in thinking about the medical terrain. And also this idea of whether you need to know or not. Transfusion represents another kind of shift about human knowledge, and that is, here's a surgery, and we think of doctors, physicians, surgeons guarding their expertise and their authority very carefully. But transfusions, when they say, we have to explain this surgery to people because any person could be called on to donate blood. So again, it's this erosion of what we think of as standard, kind of guild territorialism. Instead it's like now we have to have a general education campaign. It's really the first time physicians and surgeons felt that would be not just useful but absolutely crucial, because you're going to have to turn to all of these people in their living rooms or in their bedchambers or on the street and say, okay, roll up your sleeve, I'm going to open a vein and I'm going to do this to you. So it did represent a real shift in that way as well. Yes?
So you're not using this for war or anything, but some of your examples seem to also be evocative of hysteria.
Yeah.
In a way. Mm-hmm. Transfusion sometimes in this context, a solution for hysteria or.
No, that's a really interesting connection to make, and you would think that it might be, but I think that the surgical stakes were so high that it didn't get there in time really to be used as a treatment for hysteria. I think one of the things that erodes interest in transfusion at the very end of the 19th century is they start to branch out in thinking about its curative potential, and so they start to try to treat cholera with transfusion or other kinds of illnesses. And you're right. I mean, I think if they had stayed in that line long enough, they might have gone right back to the 17th century idea of curing mental illness or curing mental symptoms, but they didn't get there in the 19th century. Then war transformed the whole idea of transfusion. Really solidified that it was for traumatic blood loss and nothing else. Yes.
Has anyone seen the new Mad Max? Yes.
Oh no, but Road Warrior is one of my favorite movies, so I'm definitely going to be seeing it.
No spoilers.
No.
Okay, well, our hero is used after blood.
Oh. I hear on Lost there was a transfusion too with a like a porcupine quill or something. I've never seen Lost.
Now you have to see Fury Road for research.
Pardon?
Now you have to see the new Mad Max movie for research.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Was there pushback from the Christian literature at the time that this was going on in the medical literature? What was the established church's position on it? Did it take a position?
It didn't really, and I think that because it could use its own version of biblical language, say like this fits with an idea that you already have about blood. The blood is the life. It could be in the 18th century. They use the image of transfusion as a sacramental image a lot of the time. So they would describe taking communion as a transfusion of God's blood. So I think that there was a way that it was already kind of metaphorically all right. That there was a way of making it work. And images say Christ. The wounds of Christ nourishing people, and also the image of Christ as a pelican who opens his breast and blood comes out to feed the flock. Again, that there's all this Christian imagery that works with transfusion in a subliminal way. I think that kept it from being a problem.
Plus, it was okay in Christian imagery to use animals.
Yes.
To represent humans.
Yeah. Oh, and the one British subject who was transfused with animal blood before the ban took effect, his name was Arthur Koja, and they asked him right before the operation if he was nervous about getting lamb's blood injected into him. He said, no, it's like the Lamb of God. That's the blood of the lamb. I'm not worried about the blood of the lamb. So, yeah.
Was there more an egalitarian or practical cultural shift that led to the reduction of bloodletting, or was it more that people were finally pursuing that more scientific method and going, okay, well, let's actually listen to our patients, observe them, empower them or not, but at least observe them and say, okay, well, we'll finally listen to the person who says, no, don't take any more blood from me.
Right.
This isn't working for me.
Yeah, that still is a great medical mystery, the suddenness with which that practice was abandoned. And some, maybe some of it is from people like Marshall Hall doing these more empirical statistical studies. But again, that didn't make him not do blood, not let blood. I mean, even those people discovering those things could still cling to this former practice. And then, scholars have said that it really is astonishing. Medical historians have said, that absolute shift from, one moment, this is still the venerable tool of the surgeon, and then so quickly it isn't. And transfusion is able to incorporate bloodletting into it, but transfusion doesn't seem to have been the thing that turned people away from bloodletting. There's something else going on, but medical historians still, they just say this is one of the great mysteries of the history of medicine, why it would happen so quickly.
Well, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.